Let's begin. So I'll ask today, our guest is Pablo Meninato, and I will ask Samira to do the honor of doing the presentation. So please.
So I'd like to welcome Dr. Pablo Meninato to our class. Dr. Pablo Meninato, a native of Argentina, is an architect, architectural critic, and educator. He received a diploma of architecture from the University of Belgrano and Buenos Aires, a master's in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania, and a PhD in architecture from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. Meninato's book, Unexpected Affinities, proposes a historical reassessment of the concept of architectural type and its impact on the design process. The book examines affinities between tactics of the ready-made as conceived by the artist Marcel Duchamp, and typological displacement, a question that reassesses correspondence between contemporary art and architecture. In his current research, Meninato investigates how various contemporary architects are developing new and original urban design tactics that enhance the quality of life in informal settlements across Latin America. Meninato has taught and practiced architecture in Philadelphia, Buenos Aires, and Monterrey. Prior to joining Temple University as associate professor, he taught at various academic institutions in the state and in Argentina. Thank you, Dr. Meninato, and we can't wait to hear more.
Thank you very much, Samira. That was a very nice introduction. And of course, thank you, Rene, for the invitation. And I think this is a great, when I saw the program that you have and the content of this seminar or including lecture series, I think it's a great subject. And I think in general, the history of Latin America itself and its architectural urbanism is fascinating. I find there is a continuous intersection between modernism and colonialism of local cultures and the tendency towards globalization. And I think it's important in this context to remember that Latin America is the most urbanized region in the planet, with a continuous mobilization of flow of people from the countryside to the cities. And as Samira was mentioning, I should say that my current research is on informal urbanism in Latin America, closer, and I happened to attend it 2 weeks ago to the presentation of Alfredo Brillenburg that on his work in Caracas. It was 2 weeks ago, and with a very engaging discussion of slum upgrading tactics in Venezuela. And I should add that I'm currently editing a book, co-editing a book on informal urbanism, where Rene Peralta is one of our main and distinguished contributors. So that said, I will start sharing the screen. I will sort of introduce a little bit who is Clorindo Testa for those who are not that familiar. But first things first, where is Buenos Aires? As you can see, it is in the southern tip of South America. It has what I would call a mild climate. To give you a reference, its latitude is similar to South Carolina. That means mild winters, relatively hot summers, but not really. It's not really a tropical city. So I think very common, I noticed in the United States and in Europe, Latin America is considered globally as a tropical territory, and Buenos Aires definitely is not a tropical city, like and the others. Regarding the foundation of Buenos Aires, I found this poem by Argentine writer very beautiful. This is just 2 sentences of the poem where he basically, he's saying that Buenos Aires, how could it have a beginning? How could never have existed? And I love this last sentence. I judge her, and it's interesting that it's a female, to be as eternal as water and air. And that gives me led to what is the real history of the foundation of the city by the Spaniards. And it has, interesting enough, it's almost like a like a combination of misunderstanding of errors, because it was founded twice, and the first time by sort of the conquistador Pedro de Mendoza, though he left a group of settlers, but they were all killed by the natives. So there was a second foundation in 1580 by Juan de Garay, which is considered the official foundation. And I have to say that through my childhood in Buenos Aires, in my elementary, high school, and my high school halls, I would see very often this painting that you see here that depicts the foundation of Buenos Aires. And looking at it again with fresh eyes, I realized that everything about this painting is terribly wrong. I think it's in a naive and mythical way. It represents one of the worst episodes of the history of humankind. That was the invasion and mass murdering of millions of indigenous people throughout the continent. And at the center of the painting, it shows Garay, supposedly the founder of the city, the conqueror with a sword. To his right, the friar with the cross, and to Garay's left, what seems to be like a public notary documenting the event. And perhaps the most horrific image is that of the Native American down on his knees, seemingly welcoming and worshiping the invader, which of course we know that that was not the case. I think I have to say it's terrible, because this is the image that so many kids in Argentina they see daily. And if we really unpack it, it's a very, very painful image. So I could have commenting on this painting, but I think it's better to move on. Around the 1700, when you see this painting, Latin America was very different to what it is right now. It has basically a series of regions. And interesting enough, what is now north of Argentina, sort of west of Brazil and Paraguay, they call it La Plata. And La Plata means silver, and comes from argent. The word Argentina comes from silver. And it's all, again, it's like a comedy of errors, all misunderstandings, because there was a myth in the region that there was a silver, or they call it a white city, full of precious metals. And the ambition of the Spaniards was to conquer that city. So they named the region Argentum, that means Argentina, that means land of the silver. And they named the river where Buenos Aires is facing, Rio de la Plata, that means Silver River. But that city never existed. It was always a myth. And there are many, many theories of how, if it was a trick by the Native Americans, or how that was their own fantasy. But it tells you a little bit of the history of a region, that always the myth and reality and the historical facts are all intertwined. Here you see a little bit what was around that time, the beginning of 18th century, the location of the city, what was a very, very small military garrison. There was nothing remarkable there. The Spaniards just needed to have like a post or a landmark, a place like a port to base. But since they didn't find any gold or any jewelry or anything that they could consider interesting, it remained for the next 200 years like a very, very small town, completely different to what was happening in Cusco in Peru, or in Mexico, or in many other places, where they immediately realized that it had a completely different set of attractions. And then we go to what is one of the key moments in the history of urbanism, that is the promulgation of the law of the Indus. I put like the key reference on screen. In 1573, the King Philip of Castile promulgated the law of the Indies. And basically the laws stipulated how the cities would be built. They realized they have arrived to a new continent. They realized they have to build new cities, and they realized they needed to have a matrix for building the city. And this matrix is fundamentally the grid. Typically, it had a public square that is like the basis of the origin of the matrix. And in the four sides, they would have the military garrison, the cathedral or church, the cabildo or city hall, and the main sort of the governor's palace. So, and you won't be surprised when you travel through Latin America, and I will have to say that this extends all the way to part of North America and Texas, Arizona, California, etc. You have cities that have a very, very similar layout. And it's interesting to quote historian Jeffrey Broadbent that who said that the law of the Indians is of the Indus, I mean, is the most influential body of urban law in human history, because so many millions of people live under this basically the same matrix. And this could have like a big, much larger checkerboard, but I wanted to show you only a few of the cities that were founded following this plan. The first two cities that you see in Argentina, Cordoba and Mendoza, but then going all the way from Santiago in Chile to Caracas in Venezuela to Guatemala and even Austin in Texas, closer to where you are. They were all founded based on this premise. And it's interesting, I'm actually in Philadelphia right now, and it's interesting, even Philadelphia was influenced by this matrix. There's no historical certainty that William Penn and Holmes were influenced by this scheme, but it's clear that it was so prevalent throughout the continent. And in so many ways, the idea of having a central square, what you see on the screen, the intersection of what is now Market and Broad Street, and the four squares, etc. It has so many features and condiments of what is the law of the Indus. In the case of Buenos Aires, that origin point, that beginning of this checkerboard was the Plaza de Mayo. Actually, obviously, was later was called this way, and the Plaza de Mayo is still today is this. Especially the political center of the city is still where across facing the plaza is the presidential palace. Across from the plaza is the cabildo or the city hall. And you see, like happens all around the Americans, both in North and South America, for many decades, the little consideration of historical buildings. And you see in the left what was the original cabildo, that it has, if I'm counting properly, 11 bays or arcades or row, and what is right now that only 5 were left, and the other ones were chopped because they were different urban interventions. But the important thing is that the location, the place, the site is the same. So little by little, and I have to insist that it was until the beginning of 20th century, it was always a very poor city. Smuggling was the main the main enterprise. There was very little to do there. There were no metals, there were nothing special. And I have to say the Spaniards didn't have a strong affinity towards cultivating the land. So it stayed for many centuries like a small town, like a almost peripheral town. And here you see, and I love this drawing or sketch for 2 reasons. On one hand, it tells you, well, the city was always, this matrix allows you to grow. So once you complete these rows and columns of city blocks, it continue grow. On the other hand, and something that I will talk a little bit later, that how do you do with that grid that is so strict when you have logical geographical accidents? So, and this plan is almost anticipating this, where you see on the other hand an idea of the city, that is the grid, on the other hand the reality of the city, that are the different geometries that derive from geography. Moving forward, beginning of 19th century, we begin a city that continues to grow, but still very, very low, in a very, very slow fashion. Obviously, as it goes far away from the central city, it begins to be less dense or more dispersed. And 1886 is a critical year. By now, the city has grown quite a bit, and later we'll go to the numbers. The population is 500,000 people, so it's already a significant town or village or a small city. Many of the streets and avenues, etc., quite a bit look like today. At the origin, always, and I will use the cursor here, is Plaza de Mayo, so that place always remained. And we begin to see how the city started negotiating with the different angles and geometries and diagonals, etc. But the year 1886 is very important because it's the year that the city became the capital of the country and a district in itself. So, so it has sort of kind of governmental and political implications. And for those who have never been in Argentina, Buenos Aires, or are not familiar with the area, it's the city and the flatness of the pampas behind. Not to, a little bit reminds me, last year, I remember exactly a year ago, I was in Oklahoma, in your city for a seminar. I also have this impression of a territory, an urban territory, and surrounded by a large extension of a plain. For me, it was clear because of the relation with the water with Chicago. I remember landing on Chicago and seeing the edge of the lake, of the big lake, and the grid of the city, and then the prairie. And it's a little bit the image that you see in Buenos Aires. As you can see, what you see here that I took from a plane flight that I took many years ago. On the left, here is the sort of the highway that separates the city district from the province of Buenos Aires. So on the left, you see the city of Buenos Aires, on the right, the province. But I was telling you before that what happens where there is a conflict between the ideal of the matrix, the ideal of the grid, and the reality of the geography. And interesting enough, you have to negotiate, and that's happening with the what I call it the rotating grid challenge, that very often they continue using a grid, but the grid, it has a different orientation, and what happens when they both merge, or they both are in contact. And this is a little, sometimes you find this very interesting situation of irregular city blocks or irregular public square, what you see here, or irregular corners and geometries, which are exceptions. I would say it's exception to the rules, but like every exception, sometimes it's more interesting. So now, moving forward, I was telling you that Buenos Aires until the end of the 19th century was a humble and small city, and suddenly they, so to speak, I have to say, they discovered that there was a source of wealth that is with the countryside and the possibility of agriculture, both for cattle and wheat and maize, etc. Suddenly, in very few years, it began to be a very rich economy, a quite rich country. And to give you an idea, in 1925, Argentina was the world's largest exporter of beef, maize, wheat, and flour, and the 10th economy in the world. I have to say, after that, everything went south, but it's interesting to remember that. And that explains a little bit what's happening, what I show you soon. The population of the city grew very much. Mostly was European population, immigration from many countries. I have to say that most, like a little bit more than half of the immigrants between those years, at the end of the 19th century, were Italian. So that gives the sort of the Argentine culture a special feature that is very Italianized and very sometimes as a joke in Latin America. They describe us as Italians that speak Spanish. And even if you look at my last name, or so many last names of Argentinians, very often they are Italians. And here you see decade by decade the growth of the city, and something that it continued growing, but not the city itself. As I told you, the city district had a very tight perimeter. So the city has been stable. That numbers are in millions on the left. It's basically the population of the city has been practically stable, 3 million people, but the suburbs or the outskirts of the city have been growing, partially because of that process that I mentioned before, that is the flow of people coming from the countryside and sometimes from neighboring countries to Buenos Aires to look for jobs. And you see how in 2010 was already more than 10 million people, the large, what in Argentina, and we call it large Buenos Aires, and it has been continuous growing. So what happens when you have suddenly a lot of money? The landowners very, very quickly became very rich. And there's a very common expression in Argentina, the new rich, los nuevos ricos, that they have a total fascinating for anything that comes from France, and including architecture. And they hire Parisian French architects to design their houses or the palaces in Buenos Aires. That comes the nickname, the Paris of South America. And especially in some traditional neighborhoods, you see many, many of these incredibly large sort of palaces or buildings or houses, however you want to call it, and all obviously from following the Beaux-Arts tradition, all trained at the Beaux-Arts. And later you have a new phenomenon that is the children of those very wealthy Argentine upper class. They go to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, and then they come back with that knowledge and they continue working on that tradition. And now most of these very, very big constructions are either embassies or owned by foundations, or in this case is a hotel. It's one of the finest hotels in Buenos Aires. But I don't know, it's almost gross to think of the amount of wealth that this social class had. Is really tremendous. And obviously, when you have such a strong sense of inequality, you have people that are not so comfortable with that inequality. And that is very often expressed through art. And I think this painting by Antonio Berni, it's almost the same word in English and Spanish, manifestation or manifestación, expressing that discontent. And if you see in the background that sign, a white sign, pan y trabajo, bread and jobs, and it's very, very, very telling. And you see people that in their faces, in their expression, men, women, children, etc., they are not happy. They are asking for a more equal society. And 1940s, a very, very astute politician, former general, realizes that, and he inaugurates what is called the Peronist movement. And this former general, then President Perón, he started everything with a big demonstration in Plaza de Mayo. And let's remember, Plaza de Mayo has been and still is the epicenter of all political events, and is what you see on the lower left, in the lower photos, both of Perón and Evita saying hi from the balcony, and on the right, the big demonstration with the flags, etc. They are both in Plaza de Mayo, facing the government's palace. And I have to say, I'm not because of the context of this presentation, I'm not getting into the minute political things, but since then, the country has been deeply divided, and practically everyone in Argentina you will talk, you ask them, are you in favor or against the Peronist government? And they will tell you a lot about them. Unfortunately, in the States, we're beginning to see that extreme polarization, but it's something that Argentina has been experienced for many, many years. Nowadays, they call it the crack. That is the big division in society between those who are in favor of this political avenue and those who are against it. But this was a little bit the sort of the urban socio-political introduction. And let's go back to architecture. That's something, some developments very interesting were happening. And a key year in the understanding of architecture in Argentina and in South America is the visit of Le Corbusier in 1929. Le Corbusier felt that he was kind of a sort of evangelical, that he had to bring architecture to other regions, to other parts of the world, and he started traveling. And his first city that he visited was Buenos Aires. It's interesting because he had heard about New York, he would go later, but he was observing the photos of the buildings that were being done in New York. I'm guessing the Chrysler building, etc., that were being like that time, and many others. He thought they were too decorated and they were not really authentically modern. And while Buenos Aires, he puts this as a question mark. It could become, and he puts in French, destiny of a new city. As an anecdote, and I always like to comment on the human part. So Le Corbusier thought that was a great opportunity. And he immediately, typical in his, on the other hand, his ambition, on the other one, his arrogance, he proposed a plan for the city. But unlike what he developed for Paris, that his main idea was to tear down large chunks of the city, he proposed creating almost like a satellite a complex of buildings. It's what you see here, that it would be a big platform on the river, and from the platform would be emerging these big towers. And that is reflected in this, I find, extremely poetic and beautiful sketch that you see on the right, that it was his vision of Buenos Aires. And later he would say, when he arrived to Buenos Aires, initially he noticed it was like all this flat band of light that was the city, and he said this city needs some verticality, and of course he was the one who proposed this verticality. I could go on and on with his sketches, how he mixed the languages. He some words like Le Rio, he mixed Spanish and French, or La Barranca, that it's also like a very, very Argentine way of calling the slope, but in the also mentioning things about that are pure, or again, La Cité, etc., that is in French. And if you look at on the upper right, you realize how were Le Corbusier's lecture. That is absolutely fascinating, that he would have these long rolls of paper, and with a very thick crayon, he would draw on top of them. And once he finished, he would go from top to bottom or left to right. An assistant would flip and he goes to the new one. And that's how he did these sketches, drawings that you see on the screen. On the left, you see that big band is the full thing. And I find it fascinating that he, at the same time, he's doing the analysis of the city, how that grid works, the changing geometries of the grid that I mentioned before. He analyzed the city block. He calls it Le Carré Español, that means like the Spanish block, how typically they have some patios or greenery in the center. He talks very, very poetically. He talks about the Argentine sky in the lower part, the Ciel Argentine. And he talks how the river that is so expansive and wide it looks like the ocean, la mer. So I think it's and obviously his proposal for the city that is already already ingrained in his sketches what he was thinking about the city. And on the lower right, he talks about even the lot, the typical lot of Buenos Aires, and what is the main problem, that is the lack of light, which I think is very remarkable, and you will see soon why. So he opened a partnership with two Argentine architects, Ferrari and Ardoy, and they developed a large master plan for the city. What you see obviously at the bottom is still his idea of the 5 towers that you remember in that sketch. And the plan is very different to what was his main proposal, La Ville Radoise, etc., than his main proposals in Europe, because it's almost a Haussmannian plan. Like the Haussmann was the MIC intervention in Paris. He almost followed that with these long avenues, these both all green areas. And what was at that point and is now the port, the old port, he was making kind of a center of spectacles and stadiums, etc. So like a multi-use entertaining area. So I was telling you that a key thing of that sketch of Le Corbusier, that is the lot looks for the sun, it would be applicable in this case. Le Corbusier's plan never materialized for Buenos Aires, but his consolement prize was this little house that he did in La Plata, that is a small town that is about 50 minutes away from Buenos Aires, and for a doctor that was for his residence and his office. And it's a very, very interesting and very intricate project. Obviously, I cannot go too much into that, but here I cropped a little bit of what was his main observation about the typical lot in Buenos Aires, that is looking for light, and the whole house is all around the central courtyard. There was a big tree there. He left the tree, so the whole house revolves around that courtyard, and light is very, very much present there. And I have to say, at that point, Argentina, Buenos Aires, the architecture of Argentina, Buenos Aires, after the visit of Le Corbusier, was a completely different landscape. You begin to see more and more architects that are kind of adopting his ideology, adopting his theories, adopting his aesthetic. And through Buenos Aires, you see many, many buildings. In Argentina, they call it rationalist, and that you have these elongated windows and the free plan, the free facade, white walls, lack of ornament, etc. All the features of Le Corbusier more or less present in these projects. So normally I was telling Rene that I was ask you if you have any questions so far about this presentation on the city. I don't know if we lost too much time.
We can do it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah. So I will keep on moving forward.
Great.
But I think Le Corbusier is, I was telling you, is a key figure in the development of architecture of 20th century architecture in Latin America, including Argentina. His presence was extremely influential, and a key character that was extremely influenced by Le Corbusier, both in his ideas, in his way of working, in his interest, was Clorindo Testa. Clorindo Testa, you see a little bit a photo of him on the right. I had the chance to meet him many times in Argentina. Buenos Aires is like a small, sort of the architecture scene in Buenos Aires is relatively small, so many openings, etc. We would cross paths, and he's always impressed me as extremely humble, extremely gentle, really old-fashioned kind of personality, nothing flashy, etc. But as you'll see when we observe his architecture, he was quite impressive. He was born in Naples, a little bit as an accident, but immediately his family moved to Argentina. He graduated from the University of Buenos Aires a few years after, you can see, of Le Corbusier's visit to the city. Then he alternated art and architecture throughout his life. So initially he won a scholarship to study painting in Italy. Then he started his practice, and he became a very, very well-known, architect that understands the mechanism of competition entries. And he won many, many competitions throughout his life. He really has a good understanding of how to follow the program of the competition and how to sort of break the rules or bend the rules of those competitions. And I thought about, before going full immerse into his architecture, so a little bit his art, and I call it a little bit an interlude. So if you're not too interested in art, you can go to the bathroom or do something and come back. But I think, contrary to Le Corbusier, that we say, well, almost you feel like his painting is a second-rated. If you ask artists, they don't have a big appreciation of Le Corbusier. Clorindo Testa was an artist in itself, and if you go to his art galleries and the art walls, they knew him. Many artists wouldn't know that he was also an architect. So he had a real strong career as an artist, which is quite remarkable. I think there are very few examples that the figure of the artist is almost equal as the architect. Here you're seeing a few paintings of him. I think it's a little bit, has a little bit of abstract expressionism, but not quite. And he really developed his own style. I like very much this mini installation of sculpture because reflects a little bit, while he was never a very sort of politically active figure or artist, you can see there is an artistic reflection here, and his idea of those people who have a house that is so humble, that is barely a few sticks and a roof, and that's it. And I think it's a very simple and at the same time almost a battle cry of the injustice of for so many people that they don't have adequate housing or they don't have adequate neighborhoods where they're living. And of all the series that usually work with series that he developed, I selected for today his series of quadriculars or grids. As you can see, they're all like theme and variations of more colorful, some are titled grids and numbers. And it's clear that that grid is related to Buenos Aires. Let's remember the grid is the matrix of the city. You cannot go through the city without thinking of it as a grid. So that grid permeates and becomes like the main agency of his art. And of all his those grids that he's doing, not surprisingly, one is titled Buenos Aires. Then, as you will see right now, is basically the kind of footprint of the center of the city that after it was transformed at the beginning of the 20th century, you have a main vertical axis and two diagonals. And that is exactly what you see here. And I put them sort of pairing them and his painting. And what is the actual city? And you see still the Plaza de Mayo. And the two main urban interventions at the beginning of the 20th century, that is the long, what they call Avenida de Mayo. Imagine for doing that, they have to tear down all the half of city blocks on each side of the avenue. So they created, that way they could create a very, very wide avenue that leads to the plaza, the Congress Square, or the Congress Plaza, that is where the Congress is sitting. So that vertical axis that you're seeing here, the Avenida de Mayo, is really a political axis. It goes from the Congress to the president, or to the executive power to the legislative power. And then they added two other diagonals. The diagonal norte leads to the Palace of Justice. So it's another very, very political oriented axis where you see the very, very impressive building. And the other one, things that happened in the country, that they started doing the other diagonal and they did it halfway, and then the political climate changed, the administration changed, and they never finished. And within that image of the city that I want you to kind of have a little bit of a presence, what you see on the right, that red rectangle, is his first really important building, again won through a competition, that is the Bank of London. And I title this section "When Brutalism Went Contextual." And I have to say, and I asked Rene at the beginning, if all of you are architectural students, some are, some no. So I will introduce a little bit what is brutalism, which is a very, very strange term that, as you know, it derives from the French expression béton brut, that means raw concrete. So, but if we look at the definition, what brutal means is, according to Merriam-Webster, is someone who lacks intelligence, sensitivity, or compassion. And of course, it would be hard to argue for an architecture that advocates a lack of intelligence, sensitivity, or compassion. But as we know, at the same time, artists always have been fascinating with whatever is strange, the ugly, and the monstrous. So you begin to understand that. And on the other hand, as a specific disciplinary question, in 1955, Rainier Baham introduced the term brutalism in the architectural discourse, and the building that sort of synthesizes what is brutalism was Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. And obviously Testa, who was a big follower of Le Corbusier, that was his last sort of tendency or iteration in his work. He kind of followed that path. So what you see here is it's sort of a sequence. You see number 1, 2, 3, and then the photographs is how, when you walk cross the Plaza de Mayo, then you get closer, and number 3, you get really close, and you begin to see the sort of the side of the building. And I have to say, it's very difficult to take photographs of this building because it's in a very, very tight area. And once you get there, this is what you see, which is a very, very impressive. Initially, you may think, well, this is completely disconnected to the context. You see the sort of neoclassical building on the left. This is the bank area in Buenos Aires. All the traditional banks have very traditional, basically neoclassical architecture. And suddenly you find this that seems to be a vocabulary completely disassociated with the sort of the neoclassical past. But when you look more, you begin to see, well, there are many things that are not so different, and you could realize that he was trying to establish a dialogue. There is a sense of bay, there is a sense of rhythm, there is a sense of cornice at the top that we'll see soon. There is a sense of ornamentation, there is a sense of a kind of vocabulary that obviously is not quite classical, but it is sort of offering a connection, a bridge, a handshake with that classical buildings that are around that. And this sketch that you see on the left, I think it's very, very precise and very clearly expresses his intention of creating a building that establishes a dialogue with that vocabulary between old and new. When you start to analyze the building parts, you begin to see that sense of rhythm, sense of order, sense of continuity between the almost Baroque building by Le Corbusier and the neoclassical buildings that are around him. And in 2015, there was a very, very popular, very, very well-curated exhibit on Latin American architecture. And the model of this building was one of the main features. And practically, I have to say, the best way to understand this building is through seeing this model, because here you can really see entirely, you can see the top part, the lower part, and the intricacy that you find through all this kind of scheme that defines the whole project. But another interesting aspect of Testa's proposal is that he thought that the bank was really a civic institution and should be conceived as that. So he thinks the interior should be like an open plaza, like an interior public plaza where people would gather and would be a place to congregate, a little bit to socialize, and to think that is part of the community. And again, and today I'm over and over repeating this question, the importance of the sketch in architecture, and how that this sketch really conveys that this idea of the interior conceived as it would be an exterior. And here you see the image, the photo of this building, and you can see how the sense of porosity, the sense of openness that the building offers. And this is a photo of the period when it was inaugurated, black and white. Sometimes these buildings, if you want to see the play of shadows and light and sculpture, etc., you can really appreciate that. And here you see again the sort of the artistic sensibility of Testa doing really a staircase as a piece, practically also you can interpret it as a sculptural piece. So that was one building, and this is the second one. Also a national competition. It's interesting that when they started working on the project, they found a glyptodon, which is sort of the family of the dinosaurs. It's a smaller version, but it was found in the park. And Testa was fascinating and almost like a reflection of this building, a reinterpretation of his own initial project. He defined that the building was like a glyptodon that has been buried for thousands of years, and suddenly it has been recovered. Obviously, he's trying to propose or imagine a new mythology for the building, but it reflects what was his main idea, that he wanted to have 4 big legs, a big chunk of building where is the reading rooms and all the social areas in the upper part, and underground will be the books that would be covered, and they would, obviously the book don't need to be protected from the sunlight. Contrary to the bank, this is really an object in a park. It doesn't have clear neighbors. It looks north and south, but it could be oriented in many ways. So it's a completely different sort of creature. I think this aerial photo really reflects what was his idea. And I really like this image, this photo, because it feels that it's almost a theatrical moment where the main character, that is the building, is at the center of the park, and all the buildings that are the residential buildings are the audience are looking at it. So I think this a little bit reflects what was his intention. And I'm showing now 2 photos, one from the front and the other one from the back of this building. You don't know how to say front and back, I said, but it doesn't have it clear. But this is from the below, from the slope going downwards. Remember, like we talk about the barranca, that is the sloping down, and where you have a longer perspective looking at in the back of the photograph would be the river, and here is the coming from the city. And here later they created what you see here, the Reader's Plaza, where you could borrow a book and read it in this kind of gated area, and you see the building from this quite different point of view. And I have to say, I was preparing this presentation and I didn't have a good photo of the space below. And I asked a friend if that lives nearby, she could take a photo. And she went the day that she's also a colleague, and they were preparing a concert. And this was a week ago. So you see with the social distance, etc., how they are organizing a concert under this big belly of the building. And that big space makes me think of another crucial and central Latin American building, that is a museum, the Mass Museum by Lina Bobardi. This is in Sao Paulo. And it's interesting that they both in many ways offer or propose a similar idea, that is a public square that is under a big structure or a big building. And they, interesting enough, they both were designed and built practically in the same time period, in the 60s. I am not aware that they were in contact one with each other, so I think they came to this solution like separately. And the artistic proposal obviously is very different. And here you see, obviously, in the case of Testa, this photo I have, they build a stage, so you don't see that space so clearly. In the case of Lina Bobarde or the Mass Museum, you can see that generous esplanade sort of extending literally more like an urban plaza. So, but I think it's interesting to compare both, and they both propose in civic buildings, and they both have a very, very strong impact in their respective cities and communities. And a little bit while closing to the end, very often we hear the expression by Mies van der Rohe, God is in the details. I like to think of a more kind of Greek god, that is Aphrodite, the god usually associated with a female goddess associated with love. And it's really remarkable. The precision of all the detailing with concrete is the only country that I can compare this kind of sensibility is Japan. And I put a little bit like a combination of points of view and perspective of this concrete, but it's it has so many details and so intricately well resolved that I think it's absolutely remarkable and really a pleasure for the eyes. So you may think, well, that I don't want to typecast as Clorindo Testa as a brutalist architect. That was a phase of his work in the 60s. And later he lived until until 2013. He always remained extremely busy architect. And he changed direction very, very abruptly. And it seemed that he almost like his art permeated his architecture. I'm not showing any of these buildings today, but I didn't want you to leave with the impression, well, Clorindo Testa, and unfortunately that's very common in the history books, that they only show those two projects that we've seen. And when he developed a very remarkable career, and many critics say that the most interesting work came afterwards, and he did from houses, from museums, from cultural centers, from universities, looking another cultural center, and a very, very interesting esplanade in Mar del Plata, in the coast of Argentina, facing the beach, and where you see the terraces in the lower right. So I've been showing you through the presentation many sketches and drawings done by different, by Le Corbusier, by Testa, and by the Law of the Indians, all the sketches about cities, etc. And it's interesting that we're living in a time when the sketch is a little bit put aside in architectural schools, where over and over computer images take the prevalence over the hand drawing. And I think it's so important, the capacity of conveying ideas that has the hand drawn or the sketches. And since I have been mentioned in so many sketches, I would like to highlight the importance of the sketch in development of the architectural project. So I would like to finish this talk simply showing you a few sketches by a group called or known as Croquiseros Urbanos de Buenos Aires. Croquiseros means sketchers, basically, which has more than 100 members of different ages and professions. Of course, many of them are architects, artists, and illustrators that once a month they go to a certain neighborhood or place and they just sketch for hours. And I think when they told me that, I thought it was such a nice idea. I have a few friends that are members of this group, and one told me something quite interesting, that even when they go to a place where he has been many times, when he starts sketching, he always finds something new that it forces you to see the reality, the space, the urban space, with new, interesting and different eyes, which I think is very, very interesting. And this friend that I was telling you, his name is in the screen, Ignacio, he did this sketch. What I found fascinating when I saw it is like you never see this point of view. It's almost like because there's full of trees and the topography, etc. But it's almost like the idealized understanding of the building, and the essence of the building is more clearly in the sketch than any photograph you could think of. You could take, and which is that enormous mastodon. A glyptodon or animal or whatever you want to call it, standing on 4 legs. And here you can see that very, very well, and the terrace or the esplanade going underneath. And that said, thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer.
Wow, thank you. That was great that you were able to finish the whole thing. And wow, amazing sketches. They're amazing. Yes, let's have Samira start the Q&A session. We have about 5 minutes, and I think we could squeeze some questions in there. So
thank you, Dr. Meninato. That was so inspiring. I had a question talking about lighting in Buenos Aires. I remember you were saying that there wasn't much lighting, and Le Corbusier also designed the building in a way to bring in more lighting. I wanted to know, like, why is it like that? Like, why there was the issue of lighting in Buenos Aires?
Thank you, Samira. I think that's a great question, observation. Le Corbusier was saying because of the lot size in Buenos Aires that is relatively small and it's mostly built, the typical house in Buenos Aires didn't allow enough light. So his counter proposal was to make a much larger central courtyard that would allow to flood the interior spaces with more light. And also you might have seen the facade is almost lighting for architects is very strange, because on the other one we want it, but we don't want too much. So in the facade, he creates what they call the brise soleil, that is a kind of shading. So depending on the sun orientation, you may have a more exposure or less, but you always want to have light. So I think he was very, very much aware. Obviously, the light quality in Buenos Aires is more intense than in France or in Paris, but it's less that he would also collaborate in a building in Rio de Janeiro, which is a tropical city where the lighting is much stronger. So it's interesting how it was always very, very much interesting to capture the right amount of light. And he realized that in Buenos Aires, those small lots was a challenge for the architect to resolve.
Okay, so it was both like the urban planning and housing, and also the geographic situation of the city. Okay, yeah, thank you. I had another question talking about urban planning. So I see that Buenos Aires is a very political city, and like many grids or streets focusing on more political buildings, and also like having banks or I don't know, libraries in very like more important part of the cities, like in plazas. I wanted to see like how it is for entertainment functions like hotels, theaters. I remember you showed a few pictures at the end from Clorindo, having buildings next to the beach, but I wanted to probably know a little bit more, like how are buildings designed in urban context for entertainment and like for engaging the community?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. There is one of the projects he did that was actually very intense remodeling, was of old convent right in the very nice area of Buenos Aires, whose name is Recoleta, and he transformed it into a cultural center. And that is I remember taking visitors from the US, and it's a concept that is not a quite common here, because it's not a museum, it's a cultural center where you have multiple activities. You may have an art gallery, but you may have other cultural activities, and it's very, very large and is really in the center of the city. And that in that case, it has the advantage that it has terraces, that has many sort of additional spatial situation. I have to say, Buenos Aires had a period on the 1950s and 60s that it grew very much, and they built many, many theaters and museums and these cultural centers. These last decades, I have to say, it went into a period of decadence. You don't see that many, but it's still, if you happen to go to the city, you still, fortunately, you see a lot of curiosity from the people towards cultural activities. And if you have an outdoor concert, it will be flooded of people. If you have a museum, very common, you have long lines. And it's although economically the city has been impoverished, you still see a lot of interest in cultural activities, cultural institutions, etc. Typically, the museums are either free or they cost very little. So there is a policy from the state trying to promote that, with controversies, with not always everything works well. But I think it's a good. I think it's a good tradition that I hope they keep.
Great.
Thank you. That was so amazing.
Okay, maybe one more before we leave.
One of the things that I love about Buenos Aires is that there's its architecture continues to evolve. When you think of Buenos Aires, unlike a lot of other cities, you think of one distinct feature of it. While with Buenos Aires, you do think of the Beaux Arts, but then you think of the modernism. And these styles, there's this timeline that you can see visually throughout the city. And one of the things that I like the most is one of my favorite buildings in Buenos Aires is the Kavanaugh Building, which was really one of the first skyscrapers. And it's really one of the only really good examples of an Art Deco look outside of necessarily the United States. Did that kind of touch off this building vertically? Because it seemed like it, when wealth comes in, you start seeing a big boom in building. And you're saying before then you have 3-4-story buildings, and then, like I said, that was kind of like one of the first skyscrapers. Did we really start seeing a more vertical built environment after that?
Yeah, as I told you, the visit of Le Corbusier was a watershed moment in the history of architecture of the city. And it's hard to know exactly, because obviously modernism and the idea of the skyscraper was a global idea, but many clients and people and architects were more open to the idea of vertical building. And then it comes in the 1930s, a building that you mentioned, which I agree is one of the most beautiful, extremely beautiful skyscraper with all this stepping, etc., very Art Deco, that is the Kavanaugh, also facing a park, etc., and which is a great example of that time period and of great architecture. For what you're saying, you've been in Buenos Aires, no?
No, I've never been there, but I've always been fascinated with the architecture.
Interesting, because you talk with a familiarity as if you've been there. So, well, congratulations.
I would love to go there someday, but I haven't been there.
Okay, good. I think, well, you will. Hopefully, you will see it soon, that building. But yeah, I didn't, obviously it was not part of this presentation, but I think, yes, it's a very interesting building, and it's very, very well placed within this context because it has the city on one side, the park on the other, it's facing the river. So it has all this, it's a triangular lot, etc. So it got all these different particular conditions, and that building addresses them all. So I think that's a good point, yeah.
Right. Well, unfortunately, your time is over. We could continue with more discussion, questions. Even what you think about what's happening across the river, with all that new area that has been developed, which is also a little bit more, I'd say, vertical, I guess, right? But anyway, Pablo, thank you very much. This is great. You touched on a lot of things that we were really interesting and that we were really interested in. and that life of Clodindo that we didn't know about, especially his painting, which is really really interesting. So thank you very much for the lecture, and just would ask you to remind us, what was that Spinetta song that you liked, so that we could put it on our playlist?
Ana no duerme.
Okay.
And it was when his group was Almendra.
Excellent. We'll put that in our playlist.
That's a great idea, to have a playlist associated to the lecture series. So
that's you know, music is always very urban as well. So we
absolutely
want to thank. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody who's joining us, and people who joined us from outside. And we'll see you next week. Gracias, Pablo.
Ciao, gracias. Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Rene. And goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.